Hello, everyone. Thank you for sharing your lunchtime with me. I will try to be a good lunchtime guest by keeping this light, keeping this interesting, and keeping this to about 30 minutes. So today's webinar is about engineering management, what it is, why it is important, and how all the separate elements come together to form a whole that transforms investments into valuable products. So we want to start by talking about this concept of innovation, because it's really at the heart of engineering management. First thing to notice is innovation is not synonymous with invention. Invention is this aha or eureka moment where there's a discovery or an insight made. What innovation does is transform that invention into a commercially useful and valuable product. So because of that, innovation is a manageable business process, and not just any business process, but perhaps the most important business process of all business processes. And I'm not the only one to say that. Actually, Peter Drucker said that. He says the only thing that matters is innovation. And he says that because innovation drives productivity growth, which in turn propels economic growth and living standards. So with that in mind, we should be pursuing innovation. But attempts at innovation often fail, as shown here. The 4-year success rate for new products is only 10%. So that means 90% of all new products fail within 4 years. Not a great record. We fail often because it's difficult. Innovation often fails because we have lots of moving parts. In particular, we have these emerging technologies and emerging markets. And I guess as I put it, it's more like instead of just moving, it's like maneuvering. It's like hitting a maneuvering target, in this case our emerging markets, from a maneuvering platform, which I'll call emerging technology. And I use the word maneuvering because these movements aren't always predictable. They're not like a march. It's more like things are moving in apparently random ways. And what can happen is the emerging technologies can influence the movement of the markets, and the markets can influence the movement of the technologies. So there's a lot of interaction there. So it's not an easy thing to predict. Anyway, that's why it's difficult. But that's also where engineers come in, and that's where they show their value in many ways. Engineers they have a proven capacity for technical understanding, and they're able to grasp the promise and the limitations of emerging technologies. And I think this is a prerequisite for effective leadership of an innovative enterprise. Now that capacity for technical understanding is necessary but not sufficient, as leadership as an enterprise requires more than the capacity for technical understanding. As shown in this graph, as you move up the ladder to top management, you require a higher and higher dose of interpersonal conceptual skill, many times at the expense of how much time you can devote to your technical skills. We also notice that undergraduate engineering programs tend not to address this enterprise level of conceptual thinking. And that's really where this engineering management curriculum comes in. It's designed to augment the engineer's capacity for technical understanding with interpersonal conceptual thinking skills. And when we talk about conceptual skills, we're really talking about looking at the big picture, a holistic view, and understanding the relationships and interfaces between all the different elements, looking for patterns and trends, and really keeping our eye on the fundamental outcome. All this is part of conceptual thinking. And what we're trying to do with engineering management programs are to marry up this foundation of mathematical thinking and engineering with these conceptual thinking, interpersonal kind of models, to pull these together, reach across boundaries, and create this quantitative reasoning skill set that's needed at the higher levels. So what we're going to do in this short webinar, as well as what we did in the class and do in the class, is we're going to take this tour, very high-level tour of enterprise-level conceptual thinking. So we're not going to look at a single puzzle piece, nor are we going to look at a collection of puzzle pieces loosely collected. We're looking at the assembled puzzle. We're looking at how all these pieces fit together, and if there's a change in one piece, what kind of change might be required in another piece, and how it affects the whole. So that's the whole point here. So it's really a top overview looking at the whole piece, the whole puzzle. And this is how I view the whole puzzle for enterprise management. We're looking at the gray box in the middle represents the entire process. We're taking input, capital investments, and we're trying to transform that into output, to profitable, useful products. And so we have a lot of steps in between there in the gray, and a sub-process in the bottom right, the innovation sub-process, where we're taking the output of basic research, the discoveries, the aha moments, and transforming them into profitable products or services. So that's that sub-process. But to support that sub-process, there's stuff around it, and that's the whole new product development organizational process, where we have to form a leadership team and craft a strategy, design and staff an organization, conduct and obtain basic research, and then get into the innovation sub-process, where we generate concepts in a concept portfolio, we design and develop products, we produce those products, and we market and distribute those products. And in here, there's also a feedback loop. We have to control the execution of this process so we can make it conform to our plans and make adjustments as necessary. And really, this control box can be shown interfacing to any one of these steps, but that would be a very busy chart. So I decided just to represent it as one big loop, but you can interpret that as loops anywhere along the process. And along the edges here, on the top and at the bottom, we have external influencers and supporting disciplines that help facilitate this process. So in the influencers, we have the macroeconomic environment, the legal and ethical constraints, the suppliers, the competitors, existing and future, the customers, substitute products, stockholders, debt holders. And down here, you have all the disciplines that exist only to support these functions in many ways. So marketing, finance and accounting, data analytics, systems engineering, decision support systems, physics and engineering and their models, information visualization, communication, negotiation, project management, human resources, IT and ERP systems. There's a lot of things you could put down here. But the main process is from here to here, supported by these disciplines in the context of these external influencers. So that's the big picture. And what we want to do are now look at all these different pieces in the context of this big picture. So the very first piece we looked at in the course, and the first one we'll look at here in this short webinar, is form a leadership team. And so here, the trend in leadership teams tends to be getting a bit smaller, a smaller group, moving away from on the order of 10 people to on the order of 4. Some leadership organization structures, especially in firms that are innovation focused or centered, they have a CEO supported by 3 officers: the chief operating officer, the chief innovation officer, and the chief knowledge officer. And they're trying to create some tension here between the chief operating officer, who's really focused on current operations and the near term, the short term strategy, where the innovation officer is really focused on long term strategy and R&D, etc. So this tension exists to help inform the CEO as he's trying to balance both these sometimes opposing forces. So that's the leadership team, but who do you, if they're the positions, who would you want to fill those positions? So we started looking at management thought over time, and so we looked in the 1890s, the scientific method, and that really looked at the shop floor, the factory floor, and then that kind of gave way to the administrative theories that looked at more of the general management approaches and theories. And then we have the behavioral theories, both content and process, where the behavioral content theories talked about people's basic needs and hierarchy of needs and how that motivates, and trying to satisfy those needs is what motivates people and workers. Now the process theories, the behavioral process theories, build upon that and say that's true, but there's also a component that has to do with consequences and rewards and expectations. Then we looked at how those management theories bled into leadership approaches. And we looked at about 11 approaches. We looked at the trait approach, the skills approach, the behavioral approach, the situational approach, path goal approach, leader member exchange approach. We also looked at transformational leadership, authentic leadership, servant leadership, adaptive leadership, psychodynamic leadership, and we looked at them all. And at the end, we tried to talk about how we might blend these together depending on what situation you're in, or what kind of leader you feel you are, and what kind of followers you are leading. And we talked about what would make an ideal leadership theory. And it would have to be intuitive and practical. It would have to be non-deterministic. It had to be, that means take into account traits and actions. It's not just something you're born with, but something that you are born with and perhaps can improve upon. And towards that end, it lends itself to training. And the accounts for unique interaction between leaders and followers. It's adaptive across situations and supported by a body of research tracing actions to outcomes would be very nice. And you want to emphasize ideals, inspiration, innovation. So that would be ideal. There isn't one yet. That is not an assignment for the introduction class to come up with the ideal leadership theory. That's a little beyond the scope of the class. But it was an interesting discussion nonetheless. So the next step, now that you have a leadership team, is to craft a strategy. And you're pulling from the external influences of the macroeconomic environment and all these things across the top. We'll get into more of those later. And pulling in some of the supporting disciplines of data analytics, decision support systems, and information visualization. So why would you, we're going to read this slide from right to left. The strategy development process, we really have its inputs here, the process is here, and why develop it is here. So the why develop a strategy, you really want to be able to come up with a game plan that talks about where you're driving to, what are your ends, and the scope is the domain. What market or market segment do you want to compete in, and where do you not want to compete? And the competitive advantage is a means to achieve these ends. And so it's all three together is a strategy. And you want this because you want to align and focus your effort. You want to energize and empower people and improve the organization's long-term performance. You want to align and focus the effort because if it's scattered across everything, you won't have all your resources focused on where you really want to go. So it's important to understand what your strategy is. And we're representing here as a sweet spot where you understand your customers have needs. And these needs can be satisfied by competitors' offerings or your offerings. You want to find a spot where you can satisfy these customer needs better than your competitor. And so this is that sweet spot. You don't want to compete where you don't have a capability, of course, and you don't really want to compete where you share some capability. It's best to differentiate yourself so you can find this sweet spot that's all yours and turn that into profits. And so the diagram is simple, but finding the sweet spot is not. It's difficult to find. And so what we put together is this process map that talks about some of the popular techniques that are out there and how these different techniques relate to each other. So the goal is to start from the top here and eventually find your way all the way down here where you generate strategic options, assess those options, and then pick one, and then communicate that plan, and then implement and monitor the plan. And so the main axis is through here, but we have a lot of supporting analyses that can be done to help augment some of the basics that are here and here. And what we'll do is we'll step through a few of them. We don't have time to go through every single one of them in the webinar, but let's just start from the top, try to get to the bottom and touch a few of these high points. So what we'll do is we start with formulating the mission, the values, and vision. The mission is why the organization exists, what the values are, what we believe in, and how we will behave, and the vision, what we want to be. And it's important to note that competitors in the same industry may have very similar or the same mission, values, and vision. But what they should never have the same of is your strategic plan. That should be unique to the company and how you're going to achieve your objectives, your scope, and by what competitive advantage you're going to exploit to achieve these objectives. So this is more generic, but it's important to start with. And that feeds your SWOT analysis, which is really one way to understand both internal and external positives and negatives. So internally, we're talking about your strengths and listing an organization's strengths. That would be looking internally, looking at positive things, that would be your organization's strengths. Negatively, we're looking internally and trying to find out our weaknesses. Where are we not strong? Where are we weak? Externally now, we're looking for opportunities, so things that are going on that we could take advantage of and exploit to improve things. And the threats are things that could happen in the future external to our organization that might lessen the likelihood of profitability. And so this framework is not bad. It makes sense. The problem with the framework is sometimes it's used only qualitatively. And some people get in the room, you have the loudest voice in the room dominating the conversation, and they have a whole bunch of just words in these boxes, and you don't know where to go with it. And you don't know how it relates to the other competitors in your industry. And so sometimes this exercise all by itself could become less than useful. But the framework is fine. It's just that you wouldn't want to stop here or treat it too lightly. So we're going to try to offer some other things to help focus this basic approach to understanding your internal and external positives and negatives. So the first thing we're going to look at is on the internal side. And so if you're trying to inform your strengths and weaknesses, and you're looking internally, the one thing you might want to use as a tool to help organize your thoughts is this value chain analysis proposed by Michael Porter. And what we have here are some primary activities of an organization and some supporting activities. In the primary activities here, we have our inbound logistics, and then your operations that transform those inbound logistics or the raw products coming in into products, and the outbound logistics, as well as your marketing and sales and your support. And all these things, together with your support activities, contribute to your margin. And so this is really what you want to keep your eye on. But to use this to help focus, and then there's some sub elements in each of these. So if you can define what those sub elements are and how they're connected and how they relate to each subsequent activity, and then understand how it contributes to margins, that's a great first step in understanding your strengths and weaknesses and trying to even quantify how they contribute or detract from margin. Next is we're looking externally now. So we're looking at opportunities and threats, and how do you start getting at some of that? One of the main tools is our technology forecasts. And this technology S-curve, as they're known, shows a relationship between time or engineering effort to product performance and its improvement. And it shows that many times, almost always, there's an early period where you can exert a lot of time or engineering effort and not get a whole bunch of return on your product performance. We don't have a great handle on the technology yet. The market isn't quite ready, doesn't know how we'll use it. And so there's a lot going on here as things kind of are slow. But then as we gain understanding of the technology and how to control it, and the market starts to understand how it might use it and finds uses for it, there's this growth period where for relatively small increments of time or engineering effort, you have rapid gains in product performance. That doesn't go on forever. Eventually, this does hit a mature phase where, as you're adding more and more effort, you're again not getting too many returns on your product performance. And in order to keep achieving or sustaining product performance and its growth, what we need to do is look at perhaps a second technology and then eventually a third. So the real trick here, if your company is good at assessing where we are on this curve as far as the technology is concerned. Are we embryonic? Are we growth? Are we mature? And if we can somehow predict how much time, energy, and effort we need to put in to get to any one of these, and then where we might have to jump off, and what might be waiting for us, and what can we start working on this earlier in the basic research part. If your company is good at this, that might give you a real strong competitive advantage. This is historically we aren't great as a species at predicting some of this, but it's a worthy endeavor, and when we can get it right, there's great gains to be had. So you want to model this also in your economic model and understand how these shapes and what durations they are and how quickly they curve off into your economic model and your forecast. But always put those forecasts in there with some uncertainty, and we'll get to that later. So forecasts are inherently uncertain, but they're worthwhile doing. Just because they're uncertain doesn't mean they're arbitrary or capricious. They are. You can get a lot of understanding out of doing these kind of exercises. So that's at the heart of a lot of the strategy models, these technology forecasts. Beyond so the technology forecast would really be just one part of this macroeconomic analysis that you might want to do to help inform these external opportunities and threats. So you're looking at technologies. You're also looking at your political environment, war, corruption, who's in charge of what country and what that might do to different conditions. Your socio-cultural environment, demographics and history, your legal environment, economic environment, and environmental. So all these things, you don't have to look at this when we say macroeconomic. You don't need to look at necessarily the entire globe across all time. Again, you're looking at over a precise time horizon for the industry that you're in. So not everything is important, obviously, to some industries. One thing that's important to one industry might not be important to another. So you can keep this focused on things that interest your company over the time horizon that you are viewing. So beyond the SWOT analysis and its potential inputs, well, there's one last thing here that's actually the most important one. It's really this industry analysis with Porter's 5 forces model. And really what we're looking at here is we're trying to develop a deep understanding of the structural underpinnings of profitability. And we're trying to build a quantifiable economic model and be specific about time horizons of interest. So Porter's 5 forces model talks about these 5 forces, the rivalry among competitors, but it's beyond just the rivalry among competitors. There's some forces that affect the entire industry: the threat of new entrants, the threat of substitute products or services, the bargaining power of suppliers, and the bargaining power of buyers. And so taking all these things together and not just listing what they are and what exists, but trying to quantify how they impact your economic model that you're trying to build so that you can choose one strategic option over another is important. And to understand what time horizon or horizons you are interested in. So this is a nice way to look, I think, at combining all these and really looking at opportunities and threats, and then coupling that with what you learned from your value chain analysis and how all these things affect your economic model for profitability. So now we skipped a few parts, we generate strategic options, and once we get to these strategic options, we have to pick. So how do you pick? And so I propose one, it's a partial list. There's a lot of things you could do here. What I propose here is looking at the profitability of different strategic options in the near term and the long term. Perhaps even looking at the resilience and your ability to recover from market disturbances or uncertainty. And also recognizing that some strategic decisions can't be made solely on profitability grounds. So that's what makes it extra hard, in my opinion. Many strategic decisions made by governments can't always be monetized. And so that's an extra complication that we have to account for. But all assessments, whether they're monetized or not, should acknowledge uncertainty. And so real quickly, what we can do is we can pull in some decision analysis, and there's lots of different flavors of this. Decision trees are one way, multi-objective decision analysis is another way. There's also some, but they're complementary and not necessarily mutually exclusive. I like them both. What we're trying to do here is really look at one way, if we were able to build this quantitative model, this quantitative economic model, and look at both long-term profitability with a quantitative measure of estimated average return on invested capital across years 6 through 10, that's what we'll call long-term, and that same measure across years 1 through 5 would be on this axis. So if you're trying to balance your short-term profitability and your long-term profitability, which one of these strategic options would you choose, A, B, C, D, or E? And so this assumes you built an economic model, and you have some different strategies where you could you had some different choices for your objective, scope, and competitive advantage, and so that would constitute one option, and then choice B would be distinctly different than A, and so on with C, D, and E. And so they'd all have different implications and consequences in long-term and short-term profitability. The question is, how much does your company value short-term versus long-term profitability, and where would you draw this line? If you don't really care about long-term profitability, perhaps this is the best choice. It has your largest returns on this scale. But when you start considering both scales, the choice becomes a little less clear. But at first glance, you might want to throw out B, right? Because it seems to be dominated by C. If C has higher long-term profitability and higher short-term profitability, wouldn't that be better than B? And the answer seems to be yes. But perhaps once you bring in the aspect of uncertainty, C might not always be better than B, depending on when you run your uncertainty through your economic model, and that uncertainty can come from lots of different places, especially in your technology forecasting, or even the future environment, the political, the environmental environment. We don't know who will win the next election, et cetera. So a lot of things can change. And so which one would you pick, and what's your tolerance for risk? Would you take C, who could end up way up here if everything happens perfectly? That's fantastic. But they also have some downside risk. It could be down here if everything goes bad in long term and short term. So is B perhaps a more stable choice? So that's just why you want to show uncertainty, so that you can make a decision with your eyes wide open. These decisions support systems won't necessarily tell you what decision to make, but it will help inform you so that you can make a decision with your eyes wide open based on your values and your tolerance for risk. So we'll keep moving on. So we also want to communicate that strategic plan. And once we pick one and we decide what's right for us, we want to be able to communicate that briefly and succinctly to everyone, including the investors and our employees. And we really want to be clear on what the company will pursue, and be just as clear as what we are not pursuing. Because it's important to again, you're trying to align everyone to a single purpose and a single mark. And so to disclose what we are not pursuing is very important, so people can reorient their work towards what we are pursuing. That's what trade-offs are. What you really want and what you're willing to give up to get it. So now, design and staff organization. So we've so far in this big map, we've talked about forming a team and crafting a strategy. But once we have that, we have to design and staff an organization to execute this strategy. And so, very briefly, we're using this STAR model to help visualize what we're talking. Everything flows from strategy, and that helps us determine what kind of capabilities your company needs. And from that, we need to develop a structure, the people and the practices, the metrics, rewards, and the process. As with any system, we have to pay a lot of attention to these interfaces and take a look at the consequences on the whole, as opposed to just the consequences on each individual element of this organization design framework. So very quickly, the structure includes, we looked at some of the questions and answers. How should we organize? What are the key roles? How should power be balanced? And we looked at in the course 12 different organization structures and these concepts, from things that are organized functionally, geographically, or a product kind of a focus or a customer scheme, or these matrix kind of organizational structures. We even touched briefly on these 3D matrix kind of views, but only briefly. Then we also, what's included in structure are, once we have these positions and these blocks and how they're related to other blocks, we have to talk about line and staff relationships, the span of control, the span of accountability, the span of influence, and the span of support. And we took a look at this online tool that helped you optimize a job description along these different elements, and had nice sliders so you can kind of understand how a change in one area might affect, might create gaps in others. It was a useful, interesting look. We also took a quick look at metrics and rewards. What metrics should go on the business dashboard? Meaning, what are the rules of the game? How are people going to be assessed? And what incentives will drive the right behavior? A lot goes on in these decisions. And then how are decisions made? How does the workflow between the roles, and what management processes need to be defined, and what can be left unsaid? The next piece would be the people in practice. What talent is needed? And once we decide that, what human resources practices and routines are critical to the required capabilities. Moving briefly, to keep this within the 30 minutes, we move now into design and develop products, where we're really picking up decision support systems again, and physics and engineering models, and information visualization techniques to look at this next piece, which is really the heart of the innovation process. And I wanted to link it to some very popular design thinking happenings going on right now. And design thinking is made popular by Tim Brown and Roger Martin. Roger Martin started off with this book. He talked about integrative thinking. Roger Martin is a professor at the University of Toronto, and he really talked about how you really want to embrace these competing trades of desirability, what the humans might need, what's technically feasible, and what's economically viable. And this tension and these opposing trades really help create good ideas. And so the second tenet of design thinking is to establish empathy for the users. It's not just going to get what do you want this thing to look like, what do you want this to do, but you really want to understand the culture and the context of your users before you even start generating a lot of ideas. You want to go deep with the user, understand deeply what it is they do and what they might want to do better. And then you want to generate a lot of creative choices. Some of the errors that they point out in the past is that people tend to quickly converge on a concept without fully exploring all the available concepts. And so they call for a large time for diverging and generating creative choices. And then they propose building prototypes in order to think and explore, learn by doing. Don't be afraid to fail. And so all those things sounded good to me. And what I want to do is overlay this with a process that we use in trade-off analytics. And Dr. Parnell wrote a book, or edited a book called Trade-off Analytics. And it had, in that book, they talk about this framework. It's a decision framework that I believe is very consistent with design thinking. In this framework, what's happening here is we're building there's hierarchies. And really what that is talking to the users, finding out what they want in all dimensions, not just performance, but cost and schedule and every other thing that might create this tension. What are these opposing trades? And so exploiting opposing constraints to create new solutions and establishing empathy with the users is part of the side of the decision framework. And over here, we're generating creative choices because physics has a vote. What can be done, and then we assess these ideas here by either building prototypes, and I use a very broad definition of prototypes, which could include modeling and simulation. So we do a lot of our exploration and thinking through our models, our physics-based models, our engineering models, and our performance models in order to think and explore and to assess all these ideas with these objectives. And then we roll it up to higher and higher levels of aggregation using value functions and priority weightings to aggregate to higher and higher levels so that decision makers can interact with the data, understand trends and patterns, and make decisions without losing traceability to the underpinning models and simulations and desires and creative thoughts down below in the lower part of the framework. And so 5 has a question mark because design thinking and doesn't talk much about making a choice. It just talks about generating a lot of choices and then building prototypes to think and explore. But how do you get from prototype to making one that you go forward with? And so we spend a lot of time here making a choice. It's something I think that we need to think hard about because choosing is difficult and it must be done. So another look, this is a functional block diagram of that same process. Again, so we're framing the decision, we're capturing unstructured wish lists, developing objectives, crafting measures, while at the same time identifying generic product structures, generating specific product structures, creating alternatives, and putting alternatives against the measures to pull this up through some information visualization type techniques so that we can spot trends very easily at the very top level and then drilling back down again to the underpinning models. And so you can see how not only are we trying to follow design thinking principles, but also earlier when we're talking about Michael Porter's models and trying to come up with quantitative economic models, or if we can't monetize our profitability or our usefulness, we can use other techniques such as multiple objective decision analysis to set our value. And so really what we're doing here is we're looking for this holistically framed, value-focused, fact-based, visualization-enhanced decision support process. So holistically framed is we're talking about the whole system, not a subsystem. Whatever the user will actually end up using to achieve their objectives, we need to look at that level and measure at that level, not sub-optimize at the sub-element level. So holistically framed, value-focused, because without a concept of value, all the facts in the world will be meaningless. We need some way to measure facts. The facts are here. Here's what can be done. And it's important to be over here because physics doesn't have a vote. So you want something that's value-focused, fact-based, and the reason you want value-focused because you need to assess these facts against some criteria. So here are the measures coming from the value side. These are the facts coming from we'll call it the engineering and physics side. And because physics has a vote, we have to assess how well each of these ideas go against these measures. And these measures should have these competing objectives in it across cost, schedule, performance. And then you're going to want to visualize going up because when you are done measuring all these ideas against all these values, you're going to have a lot of data on your hands. So much data that the decision team won't be able to just explore a giant spreadsheet and say, oh, there's my solution. You need some way to interact with that large data store, and make sense of it, query it, and roll it up to higher and higher levels of aggregation so you can spot trends and patterns. So really, we went through this before. This is objectives hierarchy. You can kind of see if you're coming in from the left side of our decision framework. We're looking to create this tension, desirability, feasibility, economic viability. So we have desirability here in performance, what the user wants. We have cost with the economic viability, as well as schedule, which fall into the category of technical feasibility, but also term viability might be something we want to look at. Nevertheless, we have an objectives hierarchy, so we can very clearly state and show the competing trades across at least schedule performance. And then even in performance, there tend to be some competing traits, and so we want to make sure we capture them. And so here we do capture these competing traits. Then we want to establish empathy with the users. Here we're trying to talk to the users, find out what we want, and organize their wish list into fundamental objectives. Then go to the other side, look at generating alternatives and creating choices and diverging for a long, getting thousands of alternatives instead of just one, two, or three. And once we have those, making sure we build prototypes to whatever extent is appropriate, and that might even be just modeling simulation kind of prototypes, and exploring them and up to higher and higher levels of aggregation so that we can make a choice at the decision level, high level decision, and understand what traits are involved and which path to go. So we talked about visualization and going up that decision framework. The going up talks about starting with understanding how the mind and the eyes work. And so with that understanding, we can build some techniques to compare and contrast different options in a quantified way to help spot visual patterns, trends, and exceptions so that we can understand what's happening and make good decisions. So information visualization is important to the extent that it enables good decision making. And so these are what we call the building blocks of information visualization. I think it's an important part of decision making because we're dealing with lots of data. And some of the things that they talk about at the bottom of that hierarchy are, how does the mind work? How do we perceive these different senses and the input from these different senses? In here we're just listing two different sensory channels, the visual and the verbal, but there's more, of course. And in the visual channel, the working memory is limited to about 3 chunks, and that's all it can keep in that working memory. And what we're trying to do is pass it through to the long-term memory. And so what does that mean? What are 3 chunks? And so the best way I've found to understand this is these tables and this graph represent the same data. If you look at these tables, I can't spot any trends or patterns, but it's the same data. But guess what? All I can do is see 3 chunks at a time. So I might be able to understand 3 of these cells. But by looking at 3 of those cells, I can't make any interpretation of what all the cells mean. But if I can visualize it, where now my mind is interpreting this axis, and this line as a chunk, I can now see a pattern, and I can make I can build intuition by interacting with data this way. So I thought that's the value of visualization. The other mantra of visualization is to show the data. And one of the easiest ways to understand why that is such a heavy emphasis is because these data sets are clearly different, but they have all the same summary statistics. And so, but they're clearly not the same data sets. So showing the data really helps people recognize that they're not the same, and the trends are different. Now we're going to quickly just briefly talk about producing the products. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of manufacturing approaches. Starting in the 1930s, we're looking at quality control, and then in the 1960s is when MRP and MRP2 came on board. 1980s was flushed with ideas with just-in-time, total quality management. And then in the 1990s, we saw the emergence of ERP and Six Sigma, Lean Six Sigma. And now what we're looking at is beyond Lean Six Sigma. And we are looking at how to keep your eye on the ball of this maximize profitability. Again, we're trying to have these economic models all focused to our fundamental ends. And in many enterprises, maximizing profitability is that end that we need to keep our eye on. And so when it comes to production, the means to an end are really what you can control are 3 buffers: your inventory buffer, your time buffer, and your capacity buffer. And there's the way a lot of people put this is there's always somebody waiting. The question is, which one do you want to be waiting based on your model and the decisions you made to maximize profitability? And so there are some scientific mathematical relations between this transformation process to include these buffers and demand. And so it's this matching the demand to your buffers to maximize profitability. And so I like this line of thinking, because it coincides with the basic premise of quantifiable models looking at fundamental ends, fundamental objectives, in this case, profitability, and distinguishing your means to an end, your intermediate measures, and your fundamental ends. And many times I've seen some well-intentioned Lean Six Sigma processes over-focus on one of these buffers and at the expense of profitability. And that's clearly not what you want to do. So we want to understand how all three of these are related to profitability through these intermediate measures. Project management, very briefly, we talked about there's three key musts for project management. Master your why, model your uncertainty, mind your meetings. This has to do with how meetings tend to be devouring everybody's time, and then something must be done about it, and what we can do in our settings to make sure we don't contribute to this problem. So now, master your why is very, very important, and many of the early projects I took on didn't only have a full grasp on the why. Somebody just assigned it here, manage your cost, schedule, and performance, and move on. But a lot of the questions, well, they would ask is, well, even if you succeed, why should I care? And so that's a question you don't want to be empty on. And I learned that early on in my career, and I try to emphasize that now to anybody else who might be early on in the career. Hurry up and know your why, so that a lot of times if you really know your why and why it's important that you achieve your goals, and if you do achieve your goals, why that will help the company or why that will help whatever you're trying to help, it's very important. Have a very good elevator speech for that and have it be well understood. But what we really spend time on, what I'm going to spend on time just in two charts here, so is model your uncertainty when it comes up with your planning piece. So project management, we talked about the 5 phases: initiating, planning, executing, controlling, and closing. And I'm really going to focus here only on the planning piece. And part of that planning is the process for creating and maintaining a reliable schedule. And we have all these steps in here for doing that. And the very first step is capturing all your activities and understanding how they're related and the duration of each of these activities. But the part I wanted to really emphasize is to analyze your schedule risk, because there's even well-structured and well-run plans could often come in late, only because there isn't appropriate attention given to this, what we call the merge bias. When you have a lot of things being done in parallel, and there's something waiting for all of these parallel paths to be done before it can start, and if you have some uncertainty in any one of these paths, especially if they're in all the paths, that can really dictate when you can start this. So let me show you. So if the one way around this is so it's exacerbated by the more things you have in parallel and the more uncertainty that is involved with each one, the less likely that you'll be able to start at the expected time, because the expected by definition is more or less your 50% confidence level. So let's look at what you can do. What you want to do is use statistical simulation to quantify the impact that uncertainty and schedule structure may have on completion date. So you want to be able to express your completion date with a confidence interval. And so what we're saying is I'm 7% confident that I can be complete by this date, and I'm only 50% confident I can complete it by this date. And so when you give a date, you also give some kind of confidence interval. And if you run the Monte Carlo kind of stuff through your model and its paths, you can come up with a nice chart like this. And I think it goes a long way to being very forthcoming and clear and transparent about what you know and what you don't know about your schedule. So there it is in a nutshell, the entire puzzle as I see it. So all your puzzle pieces are here. This is and the whole puzzle picture has to do with the engineering management process and how it transforms capital investments into profitable, useful products with an understanding of its environment and its influencers by making use of these supporting disciplines. And so that's what we try to do here, show the assembled piece and how the different pieces go together, not just a loose collection of puzzle pieces or just one puzzle piece. It is more the assembled puzzle. And so that's really what engineering management and it's the introductory course that I teach and the curriculum that follows is really the holistic big picture view, the relationships and interfaces, patterns and trends, and fundamental outcome focus. So we're trying to augment the engineer's proven capacity for technical mathematical thinking with these interpersonal skills and conceptual thinking to make a strong leader and capable of quantitative reasoning. So once again, thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.